Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.
Hi, welcome back to Bible Answers. I am your host, Dr. Al Garza. Today I want to be discussing a video that I came across that deals with Dr. James White responding and refuting Hank Hanegraaff in regarding to a comment he made about Scripture. And this is why I decided to comment about it, because I would have normally just left it alone, but there were some things that Dr. White misrepresented in the beginning of what this highlight reel will show regarding what Hank Hanegraaff was saying. And James White went off on a different answer in regards to what Hank Hanegraaff was trying to say. So to me, it was a misrepresentation, a misunderstanding, in a way of a straw man argument, which once you listen, you'll see what Hank Hanegraaff is referring to. Because I've been when I was early on in the 80s, in my mid to late teens, I was a great, listener of the Bible Answers Man with Walter Martin. Dr. Walter Martin was the one that kind of lit that fire underneath me to really start studying apologetics and studying the scriptures and going out there and debating and giving answers to Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, and different organizations and different non-Christian churches, and even within the Christian church itself, where I would, we would have discussions and debates on these issues. So what I'm trying to, I've been in that area of apologetics, and of course throughout my studies, this number of years I've spent studying the early church fathers, in the volumes of Schaff, LaTourette, Doctrine of the Early Church Doctrine, J.D. Kelly works, and others as well of the early church. So I spent a number of my early years studying the early church fathers, studying the scriptures, and so forth. Now, in the end, I'd say between the last 10 or 15 years of my studies, certain areas in my doctrine and beliefs, non-essential issues, changed because as I grew older and got deeper in my studies and started studying more on the Hebrew scriptures side and looking at what was understood of the first century Jewish thought, there are things that I can see that crept into the early church, why they had disagreements on different topics, and you start to pinpoint why the early church fathers had so much disagreements in different areas, and even though they were consistent on certain points of scripture and the canon, they also had disagreements of interpretation of what certain things meant or certain beliefs and doctrines. And I can tell you that I came across that and pinpointed that when I got back into what did the first century Jewish believers believe, that was Yeshua, Jesus, and the apostles and Paul and everything else. So that was an essential turning point in my studies. But what I'm going to deal with here is the fact that James White completely misrepresents what I think Hank Hanegraaff is trying to say. And I'm going to point to a book that Hank Hanegraaff wrote regarding what James White is accusing him of. I want you to listen closely what James White says, and I'm going to also stop it on two different points, a subcategory of the initial point, and I'm going to comment on that, as well as what he's trying to accuse Hank Hanegraaff of in this one section. I'm not going to go through the whole thing. There are a lot of things James White says that to me didn't have to be said. More of an ego trip, I think, on his part, that he has to make certain points that I think if he looks at his own arguments, it can be turned against him as well. So if you look at the dividing line, the whole show of what he says here, you'll see what I'm talking about, hopefully. If not, I'll be glad to point him out. But the highlight reel was enough for me to make a comment, because this is going way beyond, I think, what Hank Hanegraaff is trying to say. Now, I don't agree with Hank Hanegraaff. I'm not trying to defend him and everything he says and does. I'm not trying to agree with him on certain points. So again, this one area, I think James White failed to listen to what he was saying, and instead would jump the gun and try to accuse him of something that can be looked at as a straw man. So I want you to take a listen to this, and then we'll stop in a couple of points.
That is an area that, you can go online, listen to my church history series. People get tired of how often I point out the same thing. So what classes did you take in your education that were most important to you in apologetics? And what's been my answer for 30 years? New Testament Greek, church history.
Okay. That to me, I need to make a comment on this because it kind of made me laugh a little bit because what he says is a typical Reform scholar's thought. Anything outside of that, Greek and church history. That's the most important things in apologetics. He left out the Hebrew scriptures because the New Testament is built on the Hebrew scriptures. I've said this many times. It is very difficult to fully understand the New Testament without looking at the foundation, the Hebrew scriptures, the very scriptures that Jesus and the apostles read from, which I'm going to also discuss because he tries to point out again the Septuagint reading. That's apologetics, and I'm going to say this, and this pretty much proves my point. What scriptures did Jesus and the apostles, specifically the apostles, when they were after the resurrection, when they were defending the resurrection of Jesus and Jesus as a Messiah, what scriptures did they point to in their apologetics and defending what they believed? Did they point to? There was no New Testament. They pointed to the Hebrew scriptures, the Old Testament, their Bible of the day, not the Septuagint, which I'm going to point out. So Greek does not help you there. And I'm going to point to, again, I deal with this in brief summary in my book that I wrote, that I put on here before, More Than a Rabbi, The Word Became Flesh, a section on here on the New Testament, the Greek myth. Because it's completely outdated. You need to learn the Hebrew scriptures in their original language, of course, Hebrew, not Greek, not the Septuagint. You need to learn the Greek because that's what we have also in translation. I also encourage people to learn, Jewish history, background, context, and all that. But he only holds Greek and the church fathers. No, you should learn the Hebrew scriptures. You should learn about Jewish culture, Jewish backdrop, Jewish living, first century, Second Temple times. Learn how they lived as Jews. They were not Greek Jews. They were Hebrew Jews. Read Acts 6:1. And then you learn also in translation the Greek, because the Greek Jews wrote in the Greek text of preserving the Hebrew text. Learn that and the early church fathers after that. But if you ignore the Hebrew scriptures as a foundation, if you ignore Second Temple Jewish culture, literature, and background, you will misinterpret the scriptures, both Old, New Testament, and even come to your own conclusions, as a lot of the reformers did, and ignore the Jewish background of where they came from. So again, this is the mindset of James White. That's it. Greek and church history. Wrong. Okay, let's continue.
Yeah.
So there's a long period of time in which people did not have the Bible.
Okay. There's a long period of time.
Now, the question that was not highlighted was that Hank was asked regarding the first century, regarding the earliest text before the New Testament was written and completed. So that was a question based on that, and this is where Hank says where the people did not have the Bible for a long time. Listen to what James White thinks he says.
In which people did not have the Bible. I cannot believe I do not have.
Not people, or like a people, but the people. Hank Hanegraaff said the people, and that's a reason. Not people or a people. That's key to what James White's going to say right now.
How can I have allowed this tragedy to take place? It is a tragedy. It will be one that I will need to fix, especially because, yep, I did. Look at that. I must confess right here now, a horrific failure on my part. I do not have, in the studio with me right now, the Greek Septuagint. That's terrible. Oh, well. Oh, you know where you got yours hiding someplace, huh? Either Rich really needs to go to the restroom right now, or he knows exactly where in his old office, because I know where it is, there is a copy of what? That looks weird. Oh!
Haven't sent for
You haven't sent it yet? Oh, gosh. Well, this is only half of it. This is only half of it. That's fine. I left the other with him. So, but we do need to ship this. By the way, I thought it had been. Anyway, this is half of the Greek Septuagint right here. And it's not that it has 187 books in it or something that's so big. This is the reader's edition, which means you've got space at the bottom of the page for unusual words and stuff. And in the Septuagint, there are plenty of those. But this is actually the Hendrickson one. It's really nicely done. But I'm sending mine off to Jeffrey, so it's going to be really nicely done. He just said the church didn't have the Bible.
No, he didn't. Hank Hanegraaff said the people did not have the Bible. And I'm going to clarify what I believe Hank was referring to, and based on Hank Hanegraaff's own writings. Not the church. Again, this is the premise that Dr. White is automatically in his mind thinking that Hank Hanegraaff is talking about. And earlier, though, he said people. So now he's going to the church. So let's listen to what he wants to accuse Hank Hanegraaff of saying.
Really feel sorry for the Greek Septuagint. I feel sorry for the Hebrew Old Testament. Because once these folks start talking like this, it's like this stuff didn't exist. And now you know why I emphasize over and over and over again the fact that you need to be cognizant of, aware of, look very carefully at the citations from the Old Testament that are found in the New Testament. Because it demonstrates that the church has never been scriptureless.
And Hank Hanegraaff was not referring to them not being scriptureless. Point being that I believe Hank Hanegraaff was trying to point out was that in the first century, you're not going to walk into someone's home and say, oh, can you pull out the scroll of Isaiah for me? Or let's read the scroll of Daniel for me, please. That was not the case. People did not have Bible, so to speak, or the Hebrew scriptures in their homes available at any time. These were very expensive to write, and Dr. White knows this. Of course, you'd have to pay a scribe, and you'd have to have quite a bit of money to have him just write one book of the Hebrew Scriptures, or even the Torah, the first 5 books, and so forth. So the people, as Hank Hanegraaff, did not have a Bible, which is true. They did not have a Bible. They'd have to go to the synagogue to hear the Scriptures being read to them, and of course, the rabbis teaching on the topic, teachers, and the scribes and the leaders and so forth. This was. I don't believe for one instant this is what Hank Hanegraaff is referring to, that they did not exist or they were scriptureless. In fact, in a book that Hank Hanegraaff wrote, Has God Spoken?, he even talks about the Hebrew scriptures and in the first century and what they read from, and talks about Josephus and so forth and preservation. So he's not talking scriptureless, which I think is a misrepresentation and very poorly hearing or listening or what Hank is trying to say. He was referring to the fact that the people, the common people, did not have a Bible where they could just go and look up Isaiah, look up Jeremiah, look up Ezekiel, look up the Torah of Moses like we do today. We have a Bible. We can just open up our scriptures, go to any store and buy them. At that time, they didn't have it accessible to them. They had to go to the synagogues. They had to go to the scribes to hear and listen, to the temple to hear it being read. And again, this is where I think Dr. White completely misses the point. I think because, to me, it just seems more egotistic to have this, I'm going to correct him, but not fully understand his position. And I'm just going to correct him and make all these assumptions and so forth. Very poorly done. But I want you to listen to also what he says on another area of what they read from.
Bible of the early church, that which was Theopneustos when Paul wrote to Timothy, Greek Septuagint.
No. Theopneustos was not the Greek Septuagint. It was the Hebrew Scriptures. Again, this is completely outdated thinking and outdated sourcing. I don't know, even Daniel Wallace, Dr. Wallace, who is a Greek New Testament expert, and his videos, which you can find the link below, talks about Jesus and the first century church, Jesus and the Jews. Their authority was the Hebrew Scriptures. Even Daniel Wallace, Dr. Wallace, a Greek New Testament scholar who James White cites quite a bit in a number of areas, affirms the first century Hebrew scriptures as the Bible of the Jews, the Bible of Jesus, the Jesus that quoted from, what the apostles and Paul would have read from, not the Greek Septuagint. In fact, in my book, I deal with a little bit of this in a summary in this section. And, the Hebrew scholars of that time are clear on this. The Hebrew scholars of today, are clear on this in the consensus of what they read. Emmanuel Tov, who is one of the leading authorities on the Septuagint in Israel today and on the Hebrew Scriptures, where he refers to the first century Hebrew Scriptures as the Proto-Masoretic texts that were found within the Judean desert and even up in the Qumran communities, talks about the Bible of the temple was the Proto-Masoretic text. This is the Bible Jesus read from, the apostles Paul would have studied from, not the Septuagint. In fact, this is how they viewed what the Septuagint was to them. According to Emmanuel Tov, the text of the Septuagint was not quoted in rabbinic literatures as support for their deliberations, since no sources other than the Hebrew text was considered scripture. None. The Septuagint was not considered scripture to the first century Jews. It was the Hebrew scriptures, the Proto-Masoretic text. Read Acts 6:1. You see the Hellenistic Jews, the Greek Jews, and the Hebrew Jews, of course, meeting and eating together after the resurrection, and then, of course, having disputes. They were different categories of people. This is where Dr. White likes to talk about the God-breathed, the inspiration of the Septuagint. The Septuagint was not the considered authoritative scripture above the Hebrew scriptures. It was a translation. And in fact, during the intertestamental period, the Jews wrote in part of when they were translating into Greek and when they were doing translations, they wrote the problem with translating their writings from Hebrew to Greek, the Torah and the prophets into Greek. There was a big problem because much is lost in translation, and they point this out even in the intertestamental writings before Jesus about how there's an issue with translating the Hebrew scriptures and how even they were forced to translate the Hebrew scriptures into Greek when they were under Greek rule. And that this was forced upon them to do. It was not something they wanted to do. And basically because they held the Hebrew scriptures as God's language, God's holy tongue to the prophets and to Moses. So this is completely outdated, and James White will never want to be corrected on this because he wants to hold on to his premise of a Greek supremacy. Completely false.
That's what he's referring to. That's what Timothy would have thought of. That's what Timothy was familiar with. Was the Greek Septuagint?
No, he was not. Timothy at the synagogues, James at the synagogues, Paul. Jesus spoke to Paul in Hebrew, according to Paul, not in Greek. Even though Paul knew Greek, Jesus said he spoke to me in the Hebrew tongue. The Hebrew scriptures of the Second Temple period at the synagogue and at the temple. That's what was read. That's what was cited. Just because you have a Greek New Testament and a Greek Old Testament together in the 3rd, 4th century, and you're reading the Greek New Testament and you go to look at the quotations of the Greek Old Testament, you say, oh, look, they match up. That's circular. You're reading a Greek Old Testament with the Greek New Testament, and you're comparing them, and that's your basis for saying that they quoted from the Hebrew Scriptures. That is no different than me holding a Spanish Bible, a Spanish New Testament, and a Spanish Old Testament, saying, oh, look, they quote in Spanish the Hebrew Scripture, the Old Testament in Spanish. They must have spoke Spanish. It's no different. It was the Hebrew Scriptures. Everybody knows this. Daniel Wallace knows this. And the scholars in Israel, it's consensus based on the findings and discoveries that are going on there. So again, James White is completely outdated on this. He's completely ignoring the real evidence. And again, it's because he can't be corrected. Far be it from that happening. Because of a Greek supremacy mindset of a reformer. That's what you're going to have.
They had Scripture, which is why they would have expected to have Scripture that testified to Jesus, even though, from their perspective, I mean...
I'm going to leave it there, because then he goes on to another thing. You can watch the whole thing yourself. The point is, Hank Hanegraaff did not say that they didn't have Scripture during that time. He was not saying. In fact, he wrote a book on it. He completely understands it. He was referring to the people who did not have Scripture in their homes. It was not accessible to them like we have it today. And he talks about that also going into later on. Anybody knows that even during the Roman Catholic rule, the common folks who were illiterate at points, they didn't have Bibles in their hand. They weren't written copies. And even when the printing press going down, they had to go to the church, to the Catholics, to the Roman Catholic Church, and listen to the scriptures being read and being told how to understand it. They were controlled by the Roman Catholic Church. They were controlled on what to read, what to understand, how to live, and it was all on that. No different than in the first century, where the scribes, the Pharisees, and the leaders of the synagogues would read the scriptures and interpret them and discuss them amongst themselves. No different. The peoples did not have scrolls sitting in their homes. I cannot go knock on someone's door and say, hey, can I borrow your scroll of Isaiah, please? That's what I believe Hank Hanegraaff was saying, based on his own writings of his own books, understanding that. And for Dr. White to accuse him of that on this one area, and then he goes on in other areas, and I'm not even going to deal with it. There's just no point. But that just shows the credibility of James White's understanding of what someone else is trying to say, because of his own personal views even those views are completely off when it comes to areas of Reformed theology versus first century Jewish thought and how they understood Scripture, and the evidence that supports what I'm saying by the scholars in Israel, and even people like Daniel Wallace who understand the Hebrew Scriptures were being read, the Proto-Masoretic text. Again, this was kind of a little bit of an irritating to me, because you're accusing somebody of something that they're not saying in a straw man argument that you accuse other people of doing to you, and yet you're going to go and do it to other people. Again, and then misrepresent what they're saying and misrepresent the evidence of the Hebrew Scriptures themselves, and ignoring that foundation. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the apologetics of the apostles, when they were confronted, was the Hebrew Scriptures. They quote from them. That was their apologetic Bible. Not the New Testament that we use today, because it didn't exist, but they pointed to the passages of the Hebrew Scriptures as support for defending Jesus as the Messiah and who resurrected from the dead. So that should be our foundation as well as the New Testament, but our foundation should first be based on the Hebrew Scriptures, the apologetic Bible of the first century Jewish believers of Jesus and the apostles and Paul himself. Simple as that. So again, I'll leave it there. And again, I want to thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. This was a little bit more of a challenge for me, because emotionally I didn't like what I was hearing. So I think James White and other areas of apologetics is great, but in these areas that he deals with Greek supremacy and misrepresenting people sometimes, he knows better. So again, thank you for subscribing. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. Please like and subscribe, share. If you have questions or comments, you disagree with me, fine, leave them there. I'm glad to respond. You can email me. But again, I want to thank you for listening to Bible Answers, and I am your host, Dr. Al Garza, and have a blessed day.
Bible Answers with Dr. Al Garza.